Hey guys, so in this lesson we're going to continue where we left off in the last lesson in building our first Shiny app. And in this lesson we're going to be talking about how to build the user interface or UI. So the user interface basically defines the layout and appearance of the web application. So this is going to be where you tell Shiny what elements you want the user to interact with, right, in order to, select some data, and whatever it is you want them to manipulate. Do you want to have buttons? Do you want to have a slider on a graph like we saw in that initial startup application with a histogram? Do you want to have text inputs where the user inputs raw text? Do you want to have plot? Okay, and so that's what I'm going to be showing you in this lesson. But before I do that, I want to show you the app that we're actually going to be working on here, which I didn't do in the last lesson. So let me go ahead and do that here. So basically, we're going to be building this app, which I'm calling Democracy in Development. And the basic thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be defining over here a side panel and then a main panel, a side panel that's going to have a drop-down menu where users can select different variables, and then a main panel where we have a plot output, in this case a scatter plot, which shows the relationship between the two variables and a nice linear model to show what that relationship looks like. Okay, so this part of building the plot is going to look familiar to you because we worked so much with ggplot in this course, but now we're going to put it all together in a Shiny app framework. Okay, so basically we'll have democracy here, and then users can change like different variables. So now I have infant mortality selected, but what if I change to life expectancy, or what if I change to education or something like that, or what if instead of democracy I want to look at a different measure of governance like clientelism or corruption or women's empowerment or something like that, right? And so the user can click on that and change which variables they're looking at. So admittedly a very simple app, but I think pretty good for our first app. So that's what we're going to be doing. All right, so let's go ahead and we'll dig into that. Okay, and so what we want to do now is we want to build our basically define a UI for an application that draws a histogram. All right. So this is going to be the UI. All right, and we always start with our UI with this fluid page function. Okay, so everything that we're going to build in the UI is going to be encapsulated in this fluid page function. All right, and the first thing we want to do is we want to have a title for our app, and that's also part of the UI. It's a static part of the UI typically, but in order to have a title, we're going to call title panel and then just give it a title. And the title we're going to give this is Democracy in Development. Maybe you want to call it something else, but I think that's pretty good. And then from there, we're going to define the sidebar, where we're going to have the drop down where people can select which indicators they want to plot. All right. So here we're going to create sidebar with two drop-down menus. All right, and the two drop-down menus are going to be for the x and the y-axis. Okay, variables. So we're going to call sidebar layout for this, and then we're going to call sidebar panel. Okay, so the sidebar layout is going to create the bigger container on the side, and then the sidebar panel is going to create that panel specifically where the users can select the input. Okay, so sidebar panel. Within sidebar layout, And then we're going to call select input twice. Once for the x variable and once for the y variable input. Okay, and the select input function is going to take 3 arguments. The first is going to be, what are we going to call this input when we want to refer to it later on in the server function, right? To change the characteristics of the UI, to change what's displayed in the plot. Okay, so what do we want to call this to refer to it later? And then the second argument is the label. What do we want the label to be above this drop-down element? What do we want the users to see when they're clicking on it? And then the third argument is going to be where does the data for the selection, or where do the selections come from? And that's going to be our list of variables that we defined earlier on up here. This list called vars. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that for the x variable. So input equals xcall. We're going to call it xcall, and when we refer to it later on, this input later on, we're going to refer to it as input $xcall. All right. And then the users, we're going to have them see basically x variable. That's what they're going to see above the drop down, so they know what they're selecting on. And then choices are going to come from our list of vars, okay, which we defined up here. Okay, so that's our first input. And for our second input, we're going to do the same thing, except this time we're going to define yCall. We're going to call it y variable, and we are going to have the same choices, but here we want to add one additional argument, which is which one is going to be selected, because we don't want both drop-down elements to select the same variable, because then we won't have a scatter plot. So we have to tell it which one is going to be selected by default. So here we're going to choose the 6th variable in the list, and that's infant mortality. So it's going to, so for x, it's going to default to democracy because that's the first one in the list, and then we're going to select infant mortality as the default variable that appears in the scatter plot on the y-axis, right, when the app is loaded. All right, so selected equals vars, and we're going to select 6. So double brackets with 6 in the middle, that's going to tell it to select the 6th element in this list. Okay, and then the last part of our UI that we need to define, all right, is our main panel, where we're going to show the output, our plot, essentially. So show the scatter plot. All right, and here we're just going to call, it's very simple, main panel, and we're going to have plot output. Oops, I forgot. Here we need actually a comma. All right, and okay, so let's go back to the main panel, and here we're just going to call plot output. Whoops. Quotation marks, scatter plot. All right, and this is actually going to be an object, scatter plot, that we're going to define in our server function, which is the subject of the next video. Right, in the server function, we're going to have all of our ggplot code that produces a scatter plot, and we're going to store it in an output object called scatterplot. And then once we do that, that's going to appear here in our main panel, right? So we're calling plot output, and plot output is going to show that scatterplot that we're going to produce in the server function. And that's the subject of the next video. I'll see you there.